America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party by Heather Cox Richardson. And histories of the Republican Party are surprisingly hard to come by. I was definitely surprised when I was looking for something on this topic, how hard it was to find. There are a few histories here and there of some different periods of time that the Republicans were involved in. There are some histories of conservatism, but there's really not much. That's just a straight-up history of the Republican Party. So if you're an enterprising writer and you're looking for a niche, maybe this is it. This is one of the few that I was able to find. It's written in or published in 2014, so much more recent than I usually prefer to look at. But like I said, the histories of the Republican Party are scarce, and I don't know as though this author is all that friendly to the Republicans. There are a few Republican presidents that she seems to like, but there are quite a few Republican presidents and Republican movements and Republican initiatives that she's quite critical of. If I were a betting man, I'd say she's not a Trump supporter, although I haven't done enough research on the author to say that with 100% certainty. I haven't really looked into what she supports for present politics, but she doesn't seem to be a fan of conservatism. She sort of describes the Republican Party's best days as long behind it, and the last Republican president that she seems to have been a fan of was Eisenhower. And after Eisenhower was the rise of the conservative movement and Barry Goldwater and everyone who has followed in Barry Goldwater's footsteps. So she seems to like Lincoln. Most people do. She seems to like Teddy Roosevelt. She seems to like Eisenhower. I like Lincoln. I like Eisenhower. I even like Teddy Roosevelt, although he irritates me. I reviewed a book that was a discussion of Teddy Roosevelt previously, TR, The Last Romantic. And I pointed out a few things in that book that kind of got under my skin about Teddy Roosevelt. His fondness for military conflict was, I don't know, sometimes maybe counterproductive, got us involved in more overseas conflicts than we should have been in. And this book describes some of Teddy Roosevelt's activities that I find somewhat distasteful. So while she's a fan of Teddy Roosevelt, I'm not as much of a fan. But there are what I really want to talk about in this episode is not Teddy Roosevelt or Eisenhower or Lincoln, but rather several presidents that she discusses that she's not really a fan of, and I'm not really a fan of either, although it's kind of hard to say much about Taft. President Taft, he only had one term in office, and I don't think he was necessarily a bad president. I think he was a probably middling president, but what I want to talk about regarding Taft is how he was kind of betrayed by Teddy Roosevelt and all the problems that unfolded from that betrayal. And then I want to talk about another president a little bit who is President Harding, who I think wasn't all that great of a president either. Luckily, he had a good vice. His vice president was Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge turned out to be a pretty good president. Harding was not very good of a president. He was kind of corrupt, and he maybe didn't really know what he was doing. He was in over his head. Neither of them were all that impressive. And I want to talk a little about some of the potential consequences of their presidencies. So, like in all of my episodes, I will be reading a few sections of this book aloud, providing some commentary on some of those sections so you can hear it directly from the author and hear where she's talking about the election of President Taft. She says, quote, "After the 1904 election, Roosevelt had announced quite dramatically that he would not run again, throwing the 1908 presidential field wide open. The majority of Americans were united behind progressive ideals, with both parties endorsing Roosevelt's policies, although Roosevelt admitted that laborers had good reason to be mad at the Republicans. The election would be one of personalities. After their disastrous experiment in 1904 with Alton B. Parker, the Democrats lined up again behind perennial candidate William Jennings Bryan. The Republicans nominated Roosevelt's Secretary of War and the former governor of the Philippines, the phlegmatic, plodding William Howard Taft. Taft might not inspire the popular loyalty that Bryan did, but he inspired the loyalty that mattered in 1908, Roosevelt's. He was generally considered the president's hand-picked successor. Who would best carry out Roosevelt's vision? Bryan wanted more regulation and lower tariffs. Taft said he would simply enforce the laws already on the books, and allowed that a tariff revision was in order. Businessmen sided with the Republicans, threatening to close plants and cancel orders if Bryan were elected. According to Taft, Bryan's election will mean a paralysis of business, and we should have a recurrence of the disastrous business conditions of the last Democratic administration. In a rather lackluster election, Taft won with about 7.5 million votes to Bryan's 6.5. The real winner in 1908 was progressivism. With the main candidates endorsing Roosevelt and a slew of minor candidates arguing that his reforms did not go far enough, the 1908 election showed that the nation backed reform. In his final message to Congress shortly after the election, Roosevelt attacked the old guard and warned congressmen that workers deserved a larger share of the wealth they produced. By 1908, there were a significant number of progressive congressmen who agreed with him." End quote. So right there you can see sort of the environment. She says that the progressives were really the big winners of 1908. In 1904, President Roosevelt had announced quite dramatically that he was not going to run for election again. So he won in 1904. He became president after McKinley was killed. So 1904 was his first real election of his own. And he won in 1904. And because he had served most of McKinley's second term, he decided that his term of the 1904 to 1908 would be his last. So he announced in 1904 that he wasn't going to run in 1908. But he had, as is described, a hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. Not particularly popular, says Taft might not inspire the popular loyalty that Bryan did, but he inspired the loyalty that mattered, which was Roosevelt's. So this is Roosevelt's hand-picked man. His own Secretary of War. And the Democrats had put forward the same old William Jennings Bryan they had put forward many times before. Same guy kept running for election over and over again, kind of like the leader of the populists, the Democrats' populists. William Jennings Bryan, very popular guy, but had never actually won because the Democrats had a real hard time winning the election. After the Civil War, up until Wilson, they really won very few times. So, but they kept putting William Jennings Bryan forward because he was popular, and they were hoping to use that populism to recapture the White House. So anyhow, the progressives are popular. Roosevelt is arguing in favor of the workers and against businesses to some extent. He's arguing that workers should have a larger share of the wealth they produce. He's arguing he attacked the old guard, meaning the old guard of the Republican Party. And But she also says that the business of the country sided with the Republicans because largely they were against William Jennings Bryan. They were against the populism. So, the scenario is not exactly the same as it is now, well over a century ago. Which party represents which interests, what all their policy platforms are. They're not the same today. Clearly, they wouldn't be. But think about the Southern strategy theory that's put forward that has some truth to it about how the parties sort of switched place in the mid-20th century. Because around this time, especially like 1904, 1908, the South is a Democrat stronghold, and the North is more Republican. So the North is more pro-business, the South is more populist, the Midwest is more populist. There are leftover arrangements of the Civil War, with Lincoln being the leader of the Republicans of the North of the Civil War, the Democrats being the rebellious Southerners. That remains at this time, but keep in mind that there's a sort of conservatism in the Northern Republicans at this time, and a sort of radicalism among the populist Democrats. And William Jennings Bryan, the populist, is arguing for progressive ideas, as is Roosevelt, who's not running, but his handpicked successor, Taft, is viewed as the man of big business. So, right off the bat, you've got Roosevelt kind of arguing from a position that is opposed to his own so-called handpicked successor. He can't be adding to Taft's popularity. I doubt if he's out really campaigning in favor of Taft. Roosevelt's still campaigning for Roosevelt and his own ideas, even though he's not running for president. Now, Taft wins, but she says it's a lackluster election. So, moving on from there, she talks a bit about Taft's presidency, where she says, quote, Taft did just what he had said he would do. He applied laws already on the books to curb trusts, initiating 90 lawsuits against monopolies to Roosevelt's 44 antitrust suits. But Taft did not like conflict, or crowds, or politics. He preferred to spend time with a few cronies playing bridge or golf or sleeping or eating. He placed his faith not in an active government, which he feared was too easily corrupted by democracy, but in the courts, where educated men sat in peace and quiet and debated precedent. It illustrated his approach to the presidency that, as soon as he was safely elected, he went to Augusta, Georgia, where there was an excellent golf course, for 6 weeks to rest. Taft's conservatism came to the fore over a new tariff measure. Roosevelt had avoided a fight over the tariff, but almost as soon as Taft took office, he called Congress into special session to revise the tariff downward. House members had been working on a new bill for weeks before the session convened, and congressmen had discovered that the problem with promising a lower tariff was that voters liked the idea of lower tariffs on everything except the items they produced. This meant that there were few industries willing to take a rate cut, and few congressmen ready to accept cuts that would affect their districts. Progressives demanded significant revisions, but old guard Republicans passed their own bill after only days of debate. In the Senate, Aldrich and the Old Guard faced off against the Progressives, led by La Follette and a group of Western insurgents. In the process of reviewing the House's tariff rates, the Senate Finance Committee revised more than 800 rates upward. Outraged progressives voted repeatedly against the revisions, but because high-tariff Democrats sided with Aldrich and the Old Guard on the different pieces of the measure that affected their own constituents, the Old Guard could ignore the progressives. With La Follette and the Western progressives howling, the Payne-Aldrich tariff sailed through Congress in less than a month. The new tariff was not, in fact, a downward revision at all. To the contrary, it hurt Westerners and favored Eastern businessmen. But President Taft threw his considerable weight behind it. complaining that Western progressive Republicans were shrill, forward, stupid, demagogic, and helping the Democrats, Taft sided with Cannon and Aldrich. He called the tariff the best bill that the Republican Party has ever passed. Touring the West, Taft refused to mention the local progressive Republicans who had voted against the tariff, or pay them the traditional courtesy of permitting them to visit with him on the presidential train. In Washington, the irreverent Gridiron Club, whose members roasted political figures and whose attention Taft hated, offered guests a receipt for Roosevelt's policies, which would be kept in cold storage for the next 8 years. The fight over the tariff split the Republican Party. Progressives had hammered home the idea that the old guard was deep in the pockets of big business. In the wake of the new tariff, Cannon and Aldrich became for Westerners the symbols of trusts, financiers, and railroads. They represented the malefactors of great wealth who were destroying the nation, against whom Roosevelt had warned. Finally, when Taft's Secretary of the Interior was accused of allowing development on lands the Roosevelt administration had protected, progressives went into open revolt. End quote. So it looks like there's a tariff bill that is dividing the Republicans. The progressive Republicans want the tariff going downward. Remember, agriculturalists don't want tariffs because the United States is a net supplier of agricultural goods, and they are buying their manufactured goods, and the tariffs raise the rates on every manufactured item that the agriculturalists buy, but they don't bring in the agriculturalists any more money. So it just raises their prices. And so the farmers don't want tariffs. They want open access to foreign markets to sell our agricultural surplus. Manufacturers want the higher tariffs because they want to, the manufacturing, the owners of the businesses, the business capital wants their business to be able to charge high prices for the goods they produce. They want to eliminate foreign competition, cheap foreign competition. They want the tariffs. The workers in the North want the tariffs because wages and demand will be higher for American-made products. When there's fewer foreign-made products, the more demand there is for the American products, the more demand there is for factory workers. So the North wants the tariffs, the South doesn't want the tariffs, the populists don't want the tariffs, the business owners want the tariffs. And Taft supports the higher tariff bill, and the progressives in the Republican Party, of whom there are no few amount, are in quote-unquote open revolt. So here you find that Teddy Roosevelt kind of kicked the can. He didn't really want to deal with the tariff question. He had said at numerous times that he was a tariff supporter. He was McKinley's vice, and McKinley was big on tariffs. McKinley was a real tariff hero. And Teddy Roosevelt was not quite as pro-tariff as McKinley was, but he generally leaned toward protective policies. Taft is continuing on with the old guard Republican pro-business higher tariff policies, and the progressives and the populists want low tariffs. They want free trade. And so there's the source of the conflict. The parties are not ideologically uniform at this time. And the Republican Party particularly is split between progressives and the so-called old guard. So moving from there into where Roosevelt starts to make his big return to politics. She says, quote, Roosevelt demanded an active government to restore an economic playing field. For the good of the country, the government should regulate both big business and the terms of labor. Roosevelt called for transparency in corporate operations, regulation of businesses, and abolition of corporate funding of political campaigns. To prevent the accumulation of huge fortunes, he called for graduated income taxes and inheritance taxes. He insisted that the government must protect natural resources for future generations, rather than permit industrialists to grab them all. To guarantee that all men could rise, he called for minimum wage and maximum hours measures. as well as for better factory conditions. And to make sure that future citizens grew up healthy and sound, he called for the regulation of child labor and women's work. This fundamental defense of a just government and a healthy citizenry required a strong national government. States and cities had been passing child labor laws, cleaning up factories, and limiting women's work hours for a decade, but Roosevelt wanted to replace the patchwork of local and state regulations with a national code. Roosevelt labeled his plan the New Nationalism. Everyone in America had the same interests in a strong, healthy nation, he declared, and it was time to create a national government that acted in those interests, as Lincoln's had, rather than in the service of the rich. Of course, such a progressive vision required a strong leader, and Roosevelt was pretty sure he knew who was the best man for the job. By fall 1910, progressivism was in full swing, and the Republican old guard appeared to be on the ropes. In the November midterm elections, Democrats took control of Congress. 2 months later, Lafayette and the Congressional Progressives organized the National Progressive Republican League. The reform impulse continued to spread, and by December 1911, Roosevelt had decided to oppose Taft for the Republican nomination. When party regulars excluded Roosevelt's delegates from the convention in June 1912 and renominated Taft, Roosevelt coolly shucked the party apparatus and joined the Progressive Party, which nominated him for president in August. In a blistering speech that excoriated Taft for selling out to business, Roosevelt told his audience, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." Democrats nominated their own reformer, New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson, history professor and former president of Princeton University. The American Socialist Party also fielded a presidential ticket in 1912, led by labor leader Eugene V. Debs. All three major party platforms called for progressive reforms, and the Socialists went further, calling ultimately for an end to capitalism and for workers to seize control of the government. There was not much daylight between any of the major party candidates in the 1912 election. Of the three, Taft, with his golfing vacations and his support for the new tariff, was popularly perceived to be the representative of big business, despite his ongoing and successful campaign against trusts. The unpopularity of business as usual showed when he garnered the fewest votes of any of the three major candidates, winning only about 3.5 million votes. Still, Taft managed to pull votes from Roosevelt, who came in next with slightly more than 4 million votes. Together, these two received more votes than the winner, Governor Wilson. Although his 6.2 million votes was only a plurality, Wilson won the largest electoral majority up to that time, with 435 votes to Roosevelt's 88 and Taft's 8. Debs garnered more than 900,000 votes, 6% of the popular vote. End quote. Okay, so here we get to look at the 1912 election. And so Roosevelt didn't run in 1908. Taft won. And as we saw, progressivism is very popular around this time. And Roosevelt decides that he wants to jump back in the ring. He wants to advocate for more progressive measures. She lists a whole list of things that Roosevelt was advocating for, all fairly progressive policy points. So he tries to run for the Republican nomination against Taft. Unsuccessfully, the Republicans block his delegates from the convention, and they renominate Taft, who is, at the time, the sitting president. So Roosevelt decides he's going to join the Progressive Party. And I personally find it kind of infuriating. Taft is not doing a bad job. Taft has been using the existing laws on the books, as he described, to get the job done. He's using antitrust laws to break up the biggest businesses, more so than Teddy Roosevelt, successfully. He's pro-tariff, which There's nothing wrong with that. The Republican Party had been pro-tariff at this point for decades upon decades. For its entire existence, the Republican Party had been pro-tariff. And Roosevelt decides to jump back in the ring and support the Progressive Party. And the votes that Roosevelt got and the votes that Taft got added up to more votes than Wilson. Had Roosevelt supported Taft in the election, he probably could have pushed Taft in particular direction on particular issues in exchange for his support. But he decided he wanted to jump in the ring, and that got Woodrow Wilson elected president. He cost his own hand-picked successor the presidency by running against him, which seems to me to have been a purely egotistical move. I think it was poor judgment on Teddy Roosevelt's part, and I think Taft seems to have been a fairly decent president. He was not a radical. He was not rocking the boat, but he was using the existing laws to take a hit at big business, but also to protect American industries. He was, as she says, there was not a lot of daylight between any of the major party candidates. She's including three, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft, as the three major party candidates, and she says there was not a lot of daylight between them, excluding the socialist candidate, Eugene Debs, who was, much further to the left. But these three guys, they're all somewhat progressive. None of them are extremely radical, but Roosevelt's probably the most radical of them all. He's running on the Progressive Party, but none of them are all that far apart. And Roosevelt just screwed over his own party, screwed over his own Secretary of War, screwed over his own hand-picked successor, and gave the Democrats power. And we'll see in a future episode more about what they did with that power. We'll look at Wilson a little bit now, but not much. Mostly, we're going to save that for a later point. Let's jump to the end now of Wilson's presidency and see here where she says, quote, "As soon as the guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the Republican Congress slashed the military budget. The sudden reduction threw the country into an economic slump that created 20% unemployment. Prices had more than doubled since 1914, and squeezed between unemployment and high prices, workers across the nation struck. In the strikes, Republicans saw not an economic crisis sparked by the sudden cutbacks in federal spending, but rather communism, socialism, or anarchism. Their reaction was not as far-fetched as it might seem in retrospect. Nobody really understood how a modern economy worked in 1918. And after all, anarchists had killed McKinley in 1901 and had set off World War I by killing Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. They had not necessarily been neutralized by the war. When anarchists sent bombs to prominent Americans, including Congressman and J.D. Rockefeller in April and June 1919, Republicans believed the anarchist virus remained virulent in the United States. A September strike by more than two-thirds of Boston's 1,500 police officers who wanted the right to unionize confirmed Republicans' fears. With most of the city's officers away from their posts, thugs caroused through the streets, overturning fruit carts, taking spare tires from parked cars, smashing store windows, and stealing jewelry, hats, shirts, neckties, and above all, shoes. Men played craps in the streets, shooting dice in front of police stations. A group of toughs pulled a trolley car off its wires. The looters overall caused an estimated $34,000 in damage, about the cost of a small fire, but newspapers across the country described the events in Boston as a Bolshevist nightmare, with lawless mobs roaming through a civilized city, shooting, raping, and pillaging. Newspaper articles from California to Pennsylvania screamed, "Terror reigns in the city, and Bolshevism in the United States is no longer a specter." The Wall Street Journal warned Lenin and Trotsky are on their way. The New York Times repeated a senator's warning that something had to be done or the nation will see a Soviet government set up within 2 years. On September 11th, over the protest of Boston's Democratic mayor, who sympathized with the strikers, the Republican governor of Massachusetts took control of the city, declaring, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." With this dramatic statement, Calvin Coolidge, the unremarkable, dour politician, stepped into the limelight as the bulwark of civilization against anarchy. Newspapers across the country reprinted his picture and his message. 70,000 of his fellow citizens were so moved by this acidic Yankee that they sent letters and telegrams to his office lauding his brave stance. Labor had gone too far, commentators explained, and threatened the very existence of American government. Governor Coolidge had taken a stand against Bolsheviks in the nation and had stopped the beginnings of Soviet government. Although President Wilson joined the chorus condemning the strikers, Republican Party leaders blamed Wilson and his party for the strike. Democrats had encouraged the insolence of organized labor, the Republican Publicity Association insisted. It warned, "Unless the drive against the Republic is crushed, the country will be Russianized." Just as they had in the previous century, newspapers and business leaders charged that any group advocating government activism was plotting to destroy America. Labor unions bore the brunt of the assault, but dislike of unions also swept in church agencies whose members defended labor organization. It included African Americans, whose demand for improved labor conditions led the New York Times to sigh that there was no use in shutting our eyes to facts. Bolshevist agitation has been extending among the Negroes. Educators, too, were accused of preaching communism. Just look at the socialist professor in the White House. A majority of the college professors in the United States are teaching socialism and Bolshevism, insisted oil baron Edward L. Doheny in 1919. He went on to list executives who were sliding into the swamp, men who led J.P. Morgan's enterprises, Republican bankers, and even a man who would later become a fervent admirer of Adolf Hitler. Republicans insisted that Democrats had been over-lenient toward anarchists and murderous communists. Attacks on the tentacles of communism were not just rhetorical. During 1919 and 1920, the 2 years of what became known as the Red Scare, mobs surged against labor organizers and African Americans. Fights broke out in New York at Madison Square Garden and at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. In West Virginia, a mob forced 118 striking steelworkers to kiss an American flag. In Centralia, Washington, angry citizens led by local businessmen lynched a member of the new radical union Industrial Workers of the World called Wobblies after a fight between the mob and the union men left 4 people dead. It seemed there was a full-scale class war going on. In May 1920, police arrested 2 Italian immigrants believed to be associated with anarchists responsible for planting bombs. Police charged Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti with armed robbery and the murder of 2 men in Braintree, Massachusetts. Then in September, a drayman parked a wagon packed with dynamite and metal slugs across from J.P. Morgan's bank at the busiest corner in Wall Street. The explosion killed 33 people and destroyed $2 million in property. Although historians now think there was something in the charges against Sacco and Vanzetti, people on the street saw their arrest as the incarceration of 2 poor men by the country's wealthy power brokers. Wall Street bombing further encouraged the sense that regular people were under attack. The destruction was on Wall Street, but the 33 dead and 200 wounded were clerks and stenographers. Not one was a financier. End quote. So that's a long section there, but it's kind of describing what the situation looked like at the end of World War I. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. So Wilson's second term ends in 1920, or the election to replace him is in 1920. And World War I ends at the end of 1918. And then you've got 1919 and 1920 that are the last 2 years of Wilson's term. So these 2 years, she says, during 1919 and 1920, the 2 years of what became known as the Red Scare, et cetera, et cetera. So this is after World War I, before Wilson has left office, and it seems like total chaos. Now, keep in mind, this is only a few years after the Bolsheviks take over Russia and kill the Tsar and his family. And communism is not a imaginary specter, not some far-right conspiracy theory of communists, around every corner. The communists, the anarchists, the socialists, this is all very real. I mean, one of the first things she says is that actually, well, first of all, she says no one really understood how a modern economy worked in 1918. I'm not so sure that that's really accurate, but the anarchists had killed the U.S. president in 1901. So less than 20 years prior, only a few presidents before Wilson, they had killed, an anarchist assassin had killed McKinley. Right? So the president of the United States was a victim of anarchist agitation. Not only that, the anarchists had killed Franz Ferdinand and essentially started World War I, which led to tremendous loss of life. The anarchists are not an imaginary threat. The communists are not an imaginary threat. And I think it's also interesting how she says that the Republican Congress had slashed the military budget after World War II ended, and this sudden reduction threw the country into an economic slump that created 20% unemployment. I'm not so sure how really accurate you can link those two things together. At the end of World War I don't think anyone should be surprised that the military budget should be reduced. It's not often the case that Republicans are blamed for reducing the military budget, but that's what the Republican Party was about at that time. They didn't want to have a huge military, and they reduced the military budget at the end of World War I think probably appropriately, and I'm not sure you can blame the 20% unemployment directly on that. But at any rate, skipping over that, you've got anarchists sending bombs to congressmen. You've got anarchists sending bombs to J.D. Rockefeller. She says Republicans believed the anarchist virus remained virulent in the United States, and I think that's probably a fair belief. It's not just a conspiracy, but an accurate belief that there is at this time an anarchist threat and a communist threat. The communists were absolutely in favor of overturning existing nations to replace them with communist rule. What happened to Russia was certainly on the menu for every country. They didn't want to stop with Russia. They wanted a communist revolution worldwide. So we should keep that in mind. And then she talks about the striking police officers and the chaos that unleashed in Boston, and how Calvin Coolidge, the governor of Massachusetts, who she refers to as an acidic Yankee, stepped up and took control of the city of Boston and put the strikes to an end. She doesn't go into the details about how the strike was ended, but essentially Calvin Coolidge, the governor of Massachusetts, over the protest of Boston's Democratic mayor, took control of the city. Presumably state police, National Guard. I'm not sure exactly, but here you have an example of what could be a conservative Massachusetts, a conservative Yankee. The Northeast has become so associated with progressivism and liberalism, and there's a reason for that. Much of liberalism was born in the Northeast, but there's totally the possibility for a New England conservatism, for an old Yankee conservatism, which I wish we saw more of in the present day. But at any rate, the Republican Party blames Democrats for encouraging the organized labor and the populism that sort of blends into the socialism, the progressivism, the communism, the anarchism, all of these leftward actions. They all sort of blend together, and the Republicans blame the Democrats for opening the door to this. And yeah, you've got a lot of conflict going on in the street. You've got fights in West Virginia and New York City, all over the country. So it's crazy. The police arrested 2 Italian immigrants and charged them. They're believed to be associated with anarchists responsible for planting bombs. And people freaked out, and they got all upset about this, that these people were arrested. But it turns out they actually probably were involved. In the end, they probably were guilty. And some socialists or anarchists, I suppose, responded with a wagon full of dynamite across the street from J.P. Morgan's bank, the busiest corner of Wall Street. The explosion killed 33 people. None of them were bankers. They were just ordinary working people, killed by the anarchist bomb. Just total chaos at the time, at the end of 8 years of Woodrow Wilson. So let's pick it up from there. She says, quote, "The Wilson years had decimated the progressive Republicans. Roosevelt had moved out of the party, and Lafayette had so fervently opposed American intervention in the war that he became one of the most hated men in the country. Albert Beveridge, whose The March of the Flag speech had helped progressive rise to power, had generally backed Wilson's policies until the League of Nations, which he loathed. He had been turned out of the Senate in 1911. In the 1920s, he gave up politics altogether and turned to writing history. By 1920, progressive republicanism had lost all coherence and significance as a movement. At the 1920 Republican Convention, held in Chicago in early June, Republicans resurrected their late 19th century worldview. Roosevelt had died the year before, and though the delegates said all the right things about their departed leader, it was clear that he had taken his ideas with him. Instead, the attendees celebrated the few surviving members of the old guard, Uncle Joe Cannon and Henry Cabot Lodge, who were 84 and 70. When a Wisconsin progressive called for legislation that would relieve farmers, workers, and people generally from the intolerable economic pressures of the time, delegates laughed at him, heckled him, threatened to throw him out, and called him a socialist. The only person who drew greater disdain from the delegates was Wilson himself, who, in their view, led a party that was un-American and should be thought of as the enemy. Republicans called for a return to high tariff and cheap government. End quote. So, after the Wilson years, the Republican progressives have been driven out of the party or otherwise no longer have any power. Roosevelt has passed away, and unsurprisingly, the Republicans, they said a few nice things about him, but their support was for the old guard. And if you think about what Roosevelt did when he turned on Taft and cost the Republicans the election and put Wilson into power, you really can't blame the Republicans for not falling all over themselves in effusive praise of Teddy Roosevelt. So they kind of go back to their old ways, the higher tariff, smaller government, and support for business. But you can see the country's in a mess. So maybe it's not too bad that somebody somewhere wants to kind of go back to business as usual. Anyhow, jumping on here back to the convention, she says, quote, "Finally, the former governor of Ohio nominated favorite son Warren G. Harding, a sitting senator. In his exceedingly short speech, full of smooth platitudes, he called Harding Ohio's second McKinley, quiet, unassuming, and electable. He could carry the key state of Ohio, whose loss in 1916 had cost Republicans the presidency. As the former governor finished, pictures of Harding fluttered from the ceiling. The speech seconding Harding's nomination was even briefer than the nomination speech, making it clear how little the candidate mattered. Back to normal and America first should be the slogans of the campaign, one man said. The country needed someone safe and sane. Still, it took 10 ballots and a late-night conference in a smoke-filled room to secure the nomination for Harding, even though delegates were anxious to check out of their expensive Chicago hotels and escape the unseasonably hot weather. As soon as the nomination was announced, delegates rushed out of the meeting hall, red in the face and sweating in shirt sleeves, bawling for taxis to start the trip home. Harding was a perfect figurehead for 1920s America, an old-fashioned, small-town man with a veneer of sophistication. He was a handsome, back-slapping, card-playing, neighborly fellow from Marion, Ohio, about as far from the austere Wilson as it was possible to be. When asked about how he felt about his nomination, Harding said he felt like a man who held a pair of eights and had drawn a full house. Wilson was a smart, condescending, internationally connected college professor, a kind of frozen flame of righteous intelligence, a journalist called him. Harding was the nice guy who would keep an eye on your house while you were away. He was a wheelhorse of the old guard who hated Roosevelt's apostasy. He was undistinguished and indistinguishable, the New York Times spat. It called him a very respectable, second-class politician. Indeed, the only people really ecstatic about Harding's nomination were the townspeople of Marion, whose enthusiasm was so marked it made most of the national papers. The real headliner on the ticket was the vice presidential nominee, Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge. Thanks to his handling of the Boston police strike, Coolidge was the man of the hour, the man who would preserve America from Bolshevism. The election was so lopsided that, as one California Republican commented, if it were a prize fight, the police would interfere on the grounds of brutality. Harding's chief responsibility in the election was to keep his mouth shut and to look presidential. He was the antithesis of Wilson, and he acknowledged, even celebrated, his anti-intellectualism. He knew nothing about Europe and admitted it. As for a budding fight over wartime taxes, he told one of his secretaries he couldn't make heads or tails of the problem. He was such a terrible speaker, Wilson's son-in-law remarked that his speeches leave the impression of an army of pompous phrases moving over the landscape in search of an idea. Sometimes those meandering words would actually capture a straggling thought and bear it triumphantly, a prisoner in their midst, until it died of servitude and overwork. Wilson wanted Democratic candidate James M. Cox to rally voters around the complicated issue of the League of Nations. Harding simply promised to return to normalcy. When the votes were tallied, it turned out that most Americans were eager for normalcy. Harding and Coolidge had won more than 60% of the popular vote and had captured every state in the North and West. They had even broken into the solid South, taking Tennessee for Republicans for the first time since Reconstruction. As one observer commented, it wasn't a landslide, it was an earthquake. End quote. So this is interesting. Here you have Warren Harding, who is acknowledged all around, I think, to have been somewhat of a mediocre candidate, a mediocre president. He was kind of corrupt. He was not particularly, well prepared for the presidency, and nevertheless, it was a total landslide. Clearly, the Democrats at this point in time, at the end of Wilson's presidency, are very unpopular. It's not really just that the progressives in the Republican Party are no longer popular, but that the progressives in general are no longer popular, because everyone was clamoring for progressivism 8 years before, and then Wilson's in office, and it ends on a very rotten note. And everyone is looking at the progressives and how cozy they are with the communists and how cozy they are with the anarchists. And everyone is looking at the Democrats and blaming them for all of the chaos going on in the country. The Boston strikes probably solidified it in many people's minds. There's chaos in the streets. There's crime in the streets. The police are not doing their jobs. And the Democratic mayor supports the striking police officers and is allowing the city of Boston to be overrun by criminals in the name of socialism. And the Republican governor, Coolidge, steps in and restores law and order and sort of sets the tone that the Republicans are not going to totally bend over for the anarchists and the communists, and the Democrats are. Democrats have become very much associated with progressivism. So Harding just says, we're just going to go back to normal. We're just going to end the Wilson nightmare and go back to normal. And another interesting thing is that paired up with back to normalcy, they also want America First to be their motto, which is interesting because nowadays people think of America First as disruptive, as radical. But 100 years ago, America First was the default. And the radical view was anything that deviated from that view. So back to normalcy was also back to America First. I think that's interesting, and I think it also shows that the concept of America First has a deep pedigree in this country and is not actually radical at all. So moving on from there, the last section I want to read is when she talks about the death of Warren Harding. She says, quote, Harding brought his small-town bonhomie to the White House, where he surrounded himself with Ohio cronies who were badly out of their depth. They were known as the Ohio Gang. Herbert Hoover, who became Harding's Commerce Secretary, scornfully called them Harding's playmates and complained that they dealt poker all night in the White House. Their vision of government was primarily to see what they could get out of it for themselves and their friends. And before a year had gone by, they were playing fast and loose with the country's laws and resources. In exchange for a suitcase full of cash to the tune of $100,000 and another $25,000 loan, Harding's Secretary of the Interior had leased government oil lands in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to oil barons. One of the men happened to be Edward L. Doheny, who was the man obsessed with the threat of socialism encroaching everywhere, from colleges to J.P. Morgan's offices. Other members of the Ohio Gang, led, unfortunately, by the Attorney General, were taking kickbacks from liquor dealers and ignoring graft in the Veterans Bureau. Rumors spread of the drinking and poker playing upstairs at the White House, where the air was heavy with tobacco smoke, tables were covered with trays of whiskey bottles, and cards and poker chips were at hand, and where, one observer noted, the general atmosphere was one of waistcoat unbuttoned, feet on the desk, and the spittoon alongside. But by summer 1923, even darker rumors swirled. Rumors of corruption and law-breaking. Journalist William Allen White caught Harding one day in despair. "My God, this is a hell of a job," the president cried. "I have no trouble with my enemies, but my damn friends, my goddamn friends, White. They're the ones that keep me walking the floors nights." In July 1923, the president and Mrs. Harding embarked on a trip to Alaska and the West Coast. The scandals had begun to break, and shortly before the travelers set off, 2 members of the Ohio Gang committed suicide. Harding broke from his usual boon companions and asked the upstanding Herbert Hoover to accompany the party. Surprised, the Commerce Secretary agreed, but he soon regretted his decision. Harding was nervous, his gaiety forced as he wrung as much excitement as he could out of the parades and celebrations on his route. When he wasn't enjoying the crowds, he kept his companions tethered to the bridge table through long nights. Hoover came to so hate bridge on this journey that he never played the game again. On July 27th, during a speech, Harding faltered and dropped the pages of his manuscript. He seemed to recover, but then quickly deteriorated. The presidential train shot down to San Francisco, where the president died in his bed, most likely from a heart attack. Harding was not a bad man, Roosevelt's daughter Alice later summed him up. He was just a slob. End quote. So, nice little zinger there from Roosevelt's daughter Alice. Harding was not a bad man. He was just a slob. So, looks as though a few of his cronies there committed suicide when the wall started to close in. He takes a trip leaving Washington to go out to the West Coast. He's very nervous and upset about the way things are unfolding. Stressed, up all night playing bridge, and has a apparent heart attack while he is traveling and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, becomes president. So Harding was not a great president, clearly. And Taft, I think, was a decent president, although perhaps not great. But they act as sort of bookends to the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who we will address shortly. And Wilson was not a good president either. He had some problems we'll discuss next episode. For now, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.